The Chimes by Charles Dickens. First quarter. There are not many people, and as it is desirable as a storyteller and a story reader should establish a mutual understanding as soon as possible, I beg it to be noticed that I confine this observation nearly to young people nor to little people, but extend it to all conditions of people, little and big, young and old, yet growing up or already growing down again. There are not, I say, many people who would care to sleep in a church. I don't mean at sermon time in warm weather, when the thing has actually been done once or twice, but in the night and alone. A great multitude of persons will be violently astonished, I know, by this proposition in the broad, bold day. But it applies to night. It must be argued by night, and I will undertake to maintain it successfully on any gusty winter's night appointed for the purpose, with any one opponent chosen from the rest, who will meet me singly in an old churchyard before an old church door, and will previously empower me to lock him in, if needful to his situation, until morning. For the night wind has a dismal trick of wandering round and round a building of that sort, in moaning as it goes, and of trying with its unseen hand the windows and doors in seeking out some crevice by which to enter. And when it has got in, as one not finding what it seeks, whatever that may be, it wails and howls to issue forth again. And not content with stalking through the aisles, and gliding round and round the pillars, and tempting the deep organ, soars up to the roof, and strives to rend the rafters, then flings itself despairingly upon the stones below, and passes, muttering, into the vaults. Ah, heaven preserve us! Sitting snugly round the fire, it has an awful voice, that wind at midnight, singing in a church. But high up in the steeple, there the foul blast roars and whistles. High up in the steeple, where it is free to come and go through many an airy arch and loophole, and to twist and twine itself about the giddy stair, and twirl the groaning weathercock, and make the very tower shake and shiver. High up in the steeple of an old church, far above the light and the murmur of the town, and far below the flying clouds that shadow it, is the wild and dreary place at night, and high up in the steeple of an old church dwelt the chimes I tell of. They were old chimes, trust me. Centuries ago these bells had been baptized by bishops, so many centuries ago that the registry of their baptism was lost long, long before the memory of man, and no one knew their names. They had been their godfathers and godmothers, these bells. For my part, by the way, I would rather incur the responsibility of being godfather to a bell than a boy, and had had their silver mugs, no doubt, besides. But time has mowed down their sponsors, and Henry VIII had melted down their mugs, and they now hung nameless and mugless in the church tower. Not speechless, though. Far from it. They had clear, loud, lusty-sounding voices, had these bells, and far and wide they might be heard upon the wind. Much too sturdy chimes were they, to be dependent on the pleasure of the wind. Moreover, for, fighting gallantly against it when it took an adverse whim, they would pour their cheerful notes into a listening ear right royally, and bent on being heard on stormy nights by some poor mother watching a sick child, or some lone wife whose husband was at sea. They had sometimes been known to beat a blustering nor'wester, ay, all too fits, as Toby Veck said. For though they chose to call him Trotty Veck, his name was Toby, and nobody could make it any easier else, except for Tobias, he having been as lawfully christened in his day as the bells had been in theirs, though with not quite so much solemnity or public rejoicing. For my part, I confess myself of Toby Veck's belief, for I am sure he had opportunities enough of forming a correct one. And whatever Toby Veck said, I say. And I take my stand by Toby Veck, although he did stand all day long, and weary work it was, just outside the church door. In fact, he was a ticket porter, Toby Veck, and waited there for jobs. And a breezy, goose-skinned, blue-nosed, red-eyed, stony-toed, tooth-chattering place it was to wait in the winter-time, as Toby Veck well knew. The wind came tearing round the corner, especially the east wind, as if it had sallied forth express from the confines of the earth to have a blow at Toby. And oftentimes it seemed to come upon him sooner than it had expected, for bouncing round the corner, and passing Toby, it would suddenly wheel round again as if it cried, "Why, here he is!" Toby was curious about the bells because there were points of resemblance between them and him. They hung there in all weathers, with the wind and the rain driving in upon them, facing only the outsides of all the houses, never getting any nearer to the blazing fires that gleamed and shone upon the windows or came puffing out of the chimney tops, and incapable of participating in any of the good things that were constantly being handed through the street doors and iron railings to prodigious cooks. Being but a simple man, he invested the bells with a strange and solemn character. They were so mysterious, often heard and never seen, so high up, so far off, so full of such a deep, strong melody, that he regarded them with a species of awe. And sometimes when he looked up at the dark arched windows in the tower, he half expected to be beckoned by something which was not a bell, and yet was what he heard so often sounding in the chimes. For all this, Toby scouted with indignation a certain flying rumor that the chimes were haunted, as implying the possibility of their being connected with any evil thing. In short, they were very often in his ears, and very often in his thoughts, but always in his good opinion, and he very often got such a crick in his neck by staring with his mouth wide open at the steeple where they hung, for he was fain to take an extra trot or two afterward to cure it, the very thing he was in the act of doing one cold day, when the last drowsy sound of 12 o'clock just struck, was humming like a melodious monster of a bee, and not by any means a busy bee, all through the steeple. "Dinner time, eh?" said Toby, trotting up and down before the church. "Ah!" Toby's nose was very red, and his eyelids were very red, and he winked very much, and his shoulders were very near his ears, and his legs were very stiff, and altogether he was evidently a long way upon the frosty side of cool. "Dinner time, eh?" repeated Toby, using his right hand muffler like an infantine boxing glove, and punishing his chest for being cold. "Ah!" He took a silent trot after that for a minute or two. "There's nothing," said Toby, "more regular in its coming round than dinner time, and nothing less regular in its coming round than dinner. That's the big difference between 'em. It's took me a long time to figure it out. I wonder whether it would be worth any gentleman's while, now, to buy that obserwation for the papers, or the Parliament." Toby was only joking, for he gravely shook his head in self-deprecation. "Why, Lord," said Toby, "the papers is full of obserwations as it is, and so's the Parliament. Here's last week's paper now," taking a very dirty one from his pocket, and holding it from him at arm's length. "Full of obserwations, full of obserwations. I like to know the news as well as any man," said Toby slowly, folding it a little smaller and putting it in his pocket again. "But it almost goes against the grain with me to read a paper now. It frightens me almost. I don't know what we poor people are coming to. Lord send we may be coming to something better in the new year nigh upon us." "Why, father, father," said a pleasant voice hard by. But Toby, not hearing it, continued to trot backward and forward, musing as he went, and talking to himself. "It seems as if we can't go right, or do right, or be righted," said Toby. "I hadn't much schooling myself when I was young, and I can't make out whether we have any business on the face of the earth or not. Sometimes I think we must have a little. Sometimes I think we must be intruding. I get so puzzled sometimes when I'm not even able to make up my mind whether there is anything good at all in us, or whether we are born bad. We seem to do dreadful things. We seem to give a great deal of trouble. We are always being complained of and guarded against. One way or another we fill the papers." "Talk of a new year," said Toby mournfully. "I can bear up as well as another man most times, better than a good many, for I am strong as a lion, and all men ain't. But supposing it should really be that we have no right to a new year, supposing we really are intruding." "Why, father, father," said the pleasant voice again. Toby heard it this time, started, stopped, and shortened his sight, which had been directed a long way off as seeking for enlightenment in the very heart of the approaching year, found himself face to face with his own child, and looking close into her eyes. Bright eyes they were, eyes that would bear a world of looking in before their depth was fathomed. Dark eyes that reflected back the eyes which searched them, not flashingly or at the owner's will, but with a clear, calm, honest, patient radiance, claiming kindred with that light which heaven called into being. Eyes that were beautiful and true, and beaming with hope so young and fresh, with hope so buoyant, vigorous, and bright, despite the 20 years of work and poverty on which they had looked, that they became a voice to Trotty Veck and said, "I think we have some business here, a little." Trotty kissed the lips belonging to the eyes and squeezed the blooming face between his hands. "Why, pet," said Trotty, "what's to do? I didn't expect you today, Meg." "Neither did I expect to come, father," cried the girl, nodding her head and smiling as she spoke. "But here I am, and not alone, not alone." "Why, you don't mean to say," observed Trotty, looking curiously at a covered basket which she carried in her hand, "that you—" "Smell it, father dear," said Meg, "only smell it." Trotty was going to lift the cover up at once in a great hurry, when she gaily interposed her hand. "No, no, no," said Meg with the glee of a child. "Lengthen it out a little. Just let me lift up the corner, just the little tiny corner, you know," Meg said, suiting the action to the word with the utmost gentleness, and speaking very softly, as if she were afraid of something being heard by something inside the basket. "There. Now, what's that?" Toby took the shortest possible sniff at the edge of the basket and cried out in rapture, "Why, it's hot! It is burning hot!" cried Meg. "Ha, ha, ha! It's scalding hot!" "Ah, ha, ha!" roared Toby with a sort of kick. "It's scalding hot!" "But what is it, father?" said Meg. "Come, you haven't guessed what it is, and you must guess what it is. I can't think of taking it out till you guess what it is." "Don't be in such a hurry. Wait a minute. A little bit more of the cover. Now guess." Meg was in a perfect fright lest he should guess right too soon, shrinking away as she held the basket toward him, curling up her pretty shoulders, stopping her ear with his hand, as if by doing so she could keep the right word out of Toby's lips, and laughing softly the whole time. Meanwhile Toby, putting a hand on each knee, bent down his nose to the basket and took a long inspiration at the lid. The grin upon his withered face expanded in the process, as if he were inhaling laughing gas. "Ah, that's very nice," said Toby. "It ain't— I don't suppose it is Polonese." "No, no, no," cried Meg, delighted. "Nothing like Polonese." "No," said Toby, after another sniff. It's mellower than Polonese. It's very nice. It improves every moment. It's too decided for trotters, ain't it?" Meg was in ecstasy. He could not have gone wider of the mark than trotters, except Polonese. "Liver?" said Toby, communing with himself. "No, there's a mildness about it that doesn't answer to liver." "Potatoes?" "No, it ain't faint enough for potatoes. It wants the stringiness of cock's heads, and I know it ain't sausages. I'll tell you what it is. It's chitterlings." "No, it ain't!" cried Meg in a burst of delight. "No, it ain't!" "Why, what am I thinking of?" said Toby, suddenly recovering a position as near the perpendicular as it was possible for him to assume. "I shall forget my own name next. It's tripe." Tripe it was, and Meg, in high joy, protested that he should say, in half a minute more, that it was the best tripe ever stewed. "And so," said Meg, busying herself exultingly with her basket, "I'll lay the cloth at once, father, for I have brought the tripe in a basin and tied the basin up in a pocket handkerchief. And if I like to be proud for once, and spread that for a cloth, and call it a cloth, there's no law to prevent me, is there, father?" "Not that I know of, my dear," said Toby, "but they're always bringing up a new law or other. And according to what I was reading you in the paper the other day, father, what the judge said, you know, we poor people are supposed to know them all. Ha ha, what a mistake! My goodness me, how clever they think us." "Yes, my dear," cried Trotty, "and they're very fond of any one of us that did know 'em all. He'd grow fat upon the work he'd get, that man, and be popular with the gentlefolks in his neighborhood, very much so. He'd eat his dinner with an appetite, whoever he was, if it smelt like this," said Meg, cheerfully. "Make haste, for there's a potato besides. Where will you dine, father, on the post or on the steps?" Dear, dear, how grand we are! 2 places to choose from." "The steps today, my pet," said Trotty. "Steps in dry weather, post in wet. There's a great conveniency in the steps at all times, because of sitting down, but they're rheumatic in the damp." "Then here," said Meg, clapping her hands, after a moment's bustle. "Here it is, all ready, and beautiful it looks. Come, father, eat it while it's hot. Come." Since his discovery of the contents of the basket, Trotty had been standing looking at her, and had been speaking, too, in an abstracted manner, which showed that though she was the subject of his thoughts and eyes, to the exclusion even of tripe, he neither saw nor thought about her as she was at that moment, but had before him some imaginary rough sketch or drama of her future life. Roused now by her cheerful summons, he shook off a melancholy shake of the head, which was just coming upon him, and trotted to her side. As he was stooping to sit down, the chimes rang. "Amen," said Trotty, pulling off his hat and looking up towards them. "Amen to the bells, father?" cried Meg. "They broke in like a grace, my dear," said Trotty, taking his seat. "They'd say a good one, I'm sure, if they could. Many's the kind thing they say to me." "The bells do, father," laughed Meg, as she set the basin and a knife and a fork before him. "Well, seem to, my pet," said Trotty, falling to with great vigor. "And where's the difference? If I hear 'em, what does it matter whether they speak or not?" "Why, bless you, my dear," said Toby, pointing at the tower with his fork, and becoming more animated under the influence of dinner, "how often have I heard them bells say, 'Toby Veck, Toby Veck, keep a good heart, Toby. Toby Veck, Toby Veck, keep a good heart, Toby.' 1,000,000 times? More." "Well, I never!" cried Meg. She had, though, over and over again, for it was Toby's constant topic. "When things is very bad," said Trotty, "very bad indeed, I mean, almost at the worst, then it's Toby Veck, Toby Veck, job coming soon. Toby, Toby Veck, Toby Veck, job coming soon, Toby." That way. "And it comes at last, father," said Meg, with a touch of sadness in her pleasant voice. "Always," answered the unconscious Toby. "Never fails." While this discourse was holding, Toby made no pause in his attack upon the savoury meat before him, but cut and ate, and cut and drank, and cut and chewed, and dodged about from tripe to hot potato, and from hot potato back again to the tripe, with an unctuous and unflagging relish. But happening now to look all round the street, in case anybody should be beckoning from any door or window for a porter, his eyes, in coming back again, encountered Meg, sitting opposite to him with her arms folded, and only busy in watching his progress with a smile of happiness. "Why, Lord forgive me," said Trotty, dropping his knife and fork. "My love, Meg, why didn't you tell me what a beast I am?" "Father? Sitting here," said Trotty in penitent explanation, "cramming and stuffing and gorging myself, and you before me there, never so much as breaking your precious fast, nor wanting to when—" "But I have broken it, father," interposed his daughter, laughing. "All to bits. I have had my dinner." "Nonsense," said Trotty. "2 dinners in one day? It ain't possible. You might as well tell me that 2 New Year's days will come together, or that I have had a golden head all my life and never changed it." "I have had my dinner, father, for all that," said Meg, coming nearer to him. "And if you'll go on with yours, I'll tell you how and where, and how your dinner came to be brought, and something else besides." Toby still appeared incredulous, but she looked into his face with her own clear eyes, and laying her hand upon his shoulder, motioned to him to go on while the meat was hot. So Trotty took up his knife and fork again, and went to work, but much more slowly than before, and shaking his head as if he were not at all pleased with himself. "I had my dinner, father," said Meg, after a little hesitation, with Richard. His dinner time was early, and he had brought his dinner with him, and when he came to see me, we had it together, father." Trotty said, "Oh," because she waited. "And Richard says, father," Meg resumed, then stopped. "What does Richard say, Meg?" asked Toby. "Richard says, father—" Another stoppage. "Richard's a long time saying it," said Toby. "He says then, father," Meg continued, lifting up her eyes at last, and speaking with a tremble, but quite plainly, Another year is nearly gone, and where is the use of waiting on from year to year, when it is so unlikely that we shall ever be better off than we are now? He says we are poor now, Father, and we shall be poor then. But when we are young now, and the years will make us old before we know it. He says that if we wait, people in our condition, until we see our way quite clearly, the way will be a narrow one indeed, the common way, the grave, Father. A bolder man than Trotty Veck must needs have drawn upon his boldness largely to deny it. Trotty held his peace. And how hard, Father, to grow old and die, and to think we might have been cheered and helped each other. How hard in all our lives to love each other, and to grieve, apart, to see each other working, changing, growing old and gray. Even if I got the better of it, and forgot him, which I never could. Oh, Father dear, how hard to have a heart so full as mine is now, and to live to have it slowly drained out every drop, without the recollection of one happy moment of a woman's life, to stay behind and comfort me and make me better. Trotty sat quite still. Meg dried her eyes and said more gaily, that is to say, with here a laugh, and there a sob, and here a laugh and sob together. So Richard says, Father, as his work was yesterday made certain for some time to come, and as I love him, and have loved him fully 3 years, longer than that, if he knew it, will I marry him on New Year's Day, the best and the happiest day, he says, in the whole year, and one that was almost sure to bring a good fortune with it. It's a short notice, Father, isn't it? But I haven't my fortune to be settled, or my wedding dress to be made, like the great ladies, Father, have I? And he said so much, and said it in his way, so strong and earnest, and all the time so kind and gentle, that I said I'd come and talk to you, Father. And as they paid the money for that work of mine this morning, unexpectedly, I am sure, and as you have fared very poorly for a whole week, and as I couldn't help wishing there should be something to make this day a sort of holiday to you, as well as a dear and happy day to me, Father, I made a little treat and brought it to surprise you. And seeing how he leaves it cooling on the steps, said another voice. That was the voice of the same Richard who had come upon them unobserved, and stood before the father and daughter, looking down upon them with a face as glowing as the iron on which his stout sledge-hammer daily rung. A handsome, well-made, powerful youngster he was, with eyes that sparkled like the red-hot droppings from a furnace fire, black hair that curled about his swarthy temples rarely, and a smile that bore out Meg's eulogium of his style of conversation. See how he leaves it cooling on the step, said Richard. Meg don't know what he likes, not she. Trotty, all action and enthusiasm, immediately reached up his hand to Richard, and was going to address him in a great hurry, when the house door opened without any warning, and a footman nearly put his foot in the tripe. Out of the vase here, will you? You must always go and be a settin' on her steps, must you? You can't go and give a turn to none of the neighbors. Never, can you? Will you clear the road, or won't you? Strictly speaking, the last question was irrelevant, as they had already done it. What's the matter? What's the matter? Said the gentleman for whom the door was open, coming out of the house at that kind of light, heavy pace, that peculiar compromise between a walk and a jog-trot, with which a gentleman upon the smooth downhill of life, wearing creaking boots, a watch-chain, and clean linen, may come out of his house, not only without any abatement of his dignity, but with an expression of having important and wealthy engagements elsewhere. What's the matter? What's the matter? You're always a being begged and prayed, upon your bended knees you are, said the footman with great emphasis to Trotty Veck, to let our doorsteps be. Why don't you let 'em be? Can't you let 'em be? There, that'll do, said the gentleman. Hello there, porter, beckoning with his head to Trotty Veck. Come here, what's that, your dinner? Yes, sir, said Trotty, leaving it behind him in a corner. Don't leave it there, exclaimed the gentleman. Bring it here, bring it here. So this is your dinner, is it? Yes, sir, repeated Trotty, looking with a fixed eye and a watery mouth at the piece of tripe he had reserved for a last delicious tidbit, which the gentleman was now turning over and over on the end of a fork. 2 other gentlemen had come out with him. One was a low-spirited gentleman of middle age, of a meagre habit, and a disconsolate face, who kept his hands continually in the pockets of his scanty pepper and salt trousers, very large and dog-eared from that custom. It was not particularly well brushed or washed. The other, a full-sized, sleek, well-conditioned gentleman in a blue coat, with bright buttons and a white cravat. This gentleman had a very red face, as if an undue proportion of the blood in his body were squeezed up into his head, which perhaps accounted for his having also the appearance of being rather cold about the heart. He who had Toby's meat upon the fork called to the first one by name of Filer, and they both drew near together. Mr. Filer, being exceedingly short-sighted, was obliged to go so close to the remnant of Toby's dinner before he could make out what it was, that Toby's heart leaped into his mouth, but Mr. Filer didn't eat it. "This is a description of animal food, Alderman," said Filer, making little punches in it with a pencil case, "commonly known to the laboring population of this country by the name of tripe." The alderman laughed and winked, for he was a very merry fellow. Alderman, cute. Oh, a sly fellow, too, a knowing fellow, up on everything, not to be imposed upon. Deep into people's hearts he knew them, cute did. "I believe you." "But who eats tripe?" said Mr. Filer, looking around. "Tripe is without an exception the least economical and the most wasteful article of consumption that the markets of this country can by possibility produce. The loss upon a pound of tripe has been found to be, in the boiling, 7/8 of a fifth more than the loss of a pound of any other animal substance whatever. Tripe is more expensive, properly understood, than the hothouse pineapple. Taking into account the number of animals slaughtered yearly within the bills of mortality alone, and forming a low estimate of the quantity of tripe which the carcasses of these animals, reasonably well butchered, would yield, I find that the waste on that amount of tripe, if boiled, would victual a garrison of 500 men for 5 months of 31 days each, and of February over. The waste, the waste!" Trotty stood aghast, and his legs shook under him. He seemed to have starved a garrison of 500 men with his own hand. "Who eats tripe?" said Mr. Filer warmly. "Who eats tripe?" Trotty made a miserable bow. "You do you?" said Mr. Filer. "Then I'll tell you something. You snatch your tripe, my friend, out of the mouths of widows and orphans." "I hope not, sir," said Trotty faintly. "I'd sooner die of want." "Divide the amount of tripe before mentioned, Alderman," said Mr. Filer, "by the estimated number of existing widows and orphans, and the result will be 1 penny worth of tripe to each. Not a grain is left for that man. Consequently, he's a robber." Trotty was so shocked that it gave him no concern to see the alderman finish the tripe himself. It was a relief to get rid of it, anyhow. "And what do you say?" asked the alderman jocosely, with the red face of the gentleman in the blue coat. "You have heard, friend Filer. What do you say?" "What's it possible to say?" returned the gentleman. "What is to be said? Who can take any interest in a fellow like this," meaning Trotty, "in such degenerate times as these? Look at him. What an object! The good old times, the grand old times, the great old times. Those were times for a bold peasantry, and all that sort of thing. Those were the times of every sort of thing, in fact. There's nothing nowadays." "Ah," sighed the red-faced gentleman, "the good old times, the good old times." It is possible that poor Trotty's faith in these very vague old times was not entirely destroyed, for he felt vague enough at that moment. One thing, however, was plain to him, in the midst of his distress, to wit, that however these gentlemen might differ in details, his misgivings of that morning, and of many other mornings, were well founded. "No, no, we can't go right and do right," thought Trotty in despair. "There is no good in us. We are born bad." But Trotty had a father's heart within him, which had somehow got into his breast in spite of this decree. He could not bear that Meg, in the blush of her brief joy, should have her fortunes read by these gentlemen. "God help her," thought poor Trotty. "She will know it soon enough." He anxiously signed, therefore, to the young smith to take her away, but he was so busy talking to her softly at a little distance that he only became conscious of this desire simultaneously with the alderman Cute. Now, the alderman had not had his say, but he was a philosopher too. Practical, though, oh, very practical. and as he had no idea of losing any portion of his audience, he cried, "Stop!" Trotty took Meg's hand and drew it through his arm. He didn't seem to know what he was doing, though. "Your daughter, eh?" said the alderman, chucking her familiarly under the chin. "And you're making love to her, are you?" said Cute to the young smith. "Yes," returned Richard quickly, for he was nettled by the question, "and we are to be married on New Year's Day." "What do you mean?" cried Filer sharply. "Married? Why, yes, we were thinking of it, master," said Richard. "We're thinking in a hurry, see, in case it should be put down first." "Ah!" cried Filer with a groan. "Put that down, indeed, Alderman, and you'll do something. Married! Married! The ignorance of the first principles of political economy on the part of these people, their improvidence, their wickedness is, by heavens, enough to... Now look at that couple, will you?" Well, they were worth looking at, and marriage seemed as reasonable and fair a deed as they need to have in contemplation. "A man may live to be as old as Methuselah," said Mr. Filer, "and may labor all his life for the benefits of such people as those, and may heap up facts and figures and facts and figures and facts and figures, mountains high and dry, and he can no more hope to persuade them that they have no right or business to be married than he can hope or persuade them that they have no earthly right or business to be born. And that we know they haven't. We reduced that to a mathematical certainty long ago." "Come here, my girl," said Alderman Cute. The young blood of her lover had been mounting wrathfully within the last few minutes, and he was indisposed to let her come. But, setting a constraint upon himself, he came forward with a stride as Meg approached and stood beside her. Trotty kept her hand within his arm still, but looked from face to face as wildly as a sleeper in a dream. "Now we're going to give you a word or two of good advice, my girl," said the alderman in his nice, easy way. "It's my place to give advice, you know, because I'm a justice. You know I'm a justice, don't you?" Meg timidly said yes, but everyone knew Alderman Cute was a justice. Oh dear, so active a justice always, who's such a mote of brightness in the public eye as Cute. "You are going to be married, you say," pursued the alderman. "Very unbecoming and indelicate with one of your sex. But never mind that. After you're married, you'll quarrel with your husband and come to be a distressed wife. You may think not, but you will, because I tell you so. Now, I give you fair warning that I have made up my mind to put distressed wives down. So don't be brought before me. You'll have children, boys. Those boys will grow up bad, of course, and run wild in the streets without shoes or stockings. Mind you, my young friend, I'll convict them summarily, every one, for I am determined to put boys without shoes or stockings down. Perhaps your husband will die young, most likely, and you'll live with the baby, and then you'll be turned out of doors and wander up and down the streets. Now don't wander near me, my dear, for I am resolved to put all wandering mothers down. All young mothers, of all sorts and kinds, it's my determination to put down. Don't think to plead illness as an excuse with me, or babies as an excuse with me, for all sick persons and young children. I hope you know the church service, but I'm afraid not. I am determined to put down. And if you attempt, desperately and ungratefully and impiously and fraudulently attempt to drown yourself or hang yourself, I'll have no pity on you, for I have made up my mind to put all suicide down." "If there is one thing," said the alderman with a self-satisfied smile, "on which I can be said to have made up my mind more than on another, it is to put suicide down. So don't try it on. That's the phrase, isn't it? Ha ha! Now we understand each other." Toby knew not whether to be agonized or glad to see that Meg had turned deadly white and dropped her lover's hand. "As for you, you dull dog," said the alderman, turning with even increased cheerfulness and urbanity to the young smith, "what do you think of being married for? What do you want to be married for, you silly fellow? If I was a fine young strapping chap like you, I should be ashamed of being milksop enough to pin myself to a woman's apron strings. Why, she'll be an old woman before you're a middle-aged man, and a pretty figure you'll cut then, with a draggle-tailed wife and a crowd of squalling children crying after you wherever you go." Oh, he knew how to banter the common people, Alderman Cute. "There, go along with you," said the alderman, "and repent. Don't make such a fool of yourself as to get married on New Year's Day. You'll think very differently of it long before next New Year's Day. A trim young fellow like you, with all the girls looking after you. There, go along with you." They went along, not arm in arm or hand in hand, or interchanging bright glances, but she in tears, he gloomy and down-looking. Were these the hearts that had so lately made old Toby's leap up from its faintness? No, no. The alderman, a blessing on his head, had put them down. "As you happen to be here," said Alderman to Toby, "you shall carry a quick letter for me. Can you be quick? You're an old man." Toby had been looking over Meg quite stupidly, made shift to murmur out that he was very quick and very strong. "How old are you?" inquired the alderman. "I'm over 60, sir," said Toby. "Oh, this man's a great deal past the average age, you know," cried Mr. Filer, breaking in as if his patience could bear something trying, but this was really carrying matters a little too far. "I feel I'm intruding, sir," said Toby. I misdoubted it this morning. Oh, dear me." The alderman cut him short by giving him the letter from his pocket. Toby would have got a shilling too, but Mr. Filer clearly showing that in that case he would rob a certain giving number of persons of 9 pence halfpenny apiece. He only got 6 pence, and thought himself very well off to get that. Then the alderman gave an arm to each of his friends, and walked off in high feather, but he immediately came back alone as if he had forgotten some. "Porter," said the alderman. "Sir," said Toby, "take care of that daughter of yours. She's much too handsome." "Even her good looks are stolen from somebody or other, I suppose," thought Toby, looking at the 6 pence in his hand and thinking of the tripe. "She's been and robbed 500 ladies of a bloom apiece. I shouldn't wonder. It's very dreadful." "She's much too handsome, my man," said the alderman. "The chances are that she'll come to no good, I clearly see. Observe what I say. Take care of her," with which he hurried off again. Wrong every way," said Trotty, clasping his hands. "Born bad, no business here." The chimes came clashing in upon him as he said the last words, full, loud, and sounding, but with no encouragement, no, not a drop. "The tune's changed," cried the old man as he listened. "There's not a word of all that fancy in it. Why should there be? I have no business with the new year, nor with the old one neither. Let me die." Still the bells, pealing forth their changes, made the very air spin. Put 'em down, good old times, good old times. Facts and figures, put 'em down, put 'em down." If they said anything, they said this, until the brain of Toby reeled. He pressed his bewildered head between his hands, as if to keep it from splitting asunder. A well-timed action, as it happened, for finding the letter in one of them, and being by that means reminded of his charge, he fell mechanically into his usual trot, and trotted off. Second quarter. The letter Toby had received from Alderman Cute was addressed to a great man in the great district of the town. The greatest district of the town. It must have been the greatest district of the town, because it was commonly called the world by its inhabitants. The year was old that day. The patient year had lived through the reproaches and misuses of its slanderers, and faithfully performed its work. Spring, summer, autumn, winter, it had labored through the destined year, and now laid down its weary head to die. Trotty had no portion, to his thinking, in the new year or the old. Put 'em down, facts and figures, good old times, put 'em down, put 'em down. His trot went to that measure, and would fit itself to nothing else. But even that one, melancholy as it was, brought him in due time to the end of his journey, to the mansion of Sir Joseph Bowley, Member of Parliament. The door was opened by a porter, such a porter, not of Toby's order, quite another thing. His place was the ticket, though, not Toby's. This porter underwent some hard panting before he could speak, having breathed himself by coming in cautiously out of his chair without first taking time to think about it and compose his mind. When he had found his voice, which took him some time to do, for it was a long way off and hidden under a load of meat, he said in a fat whisper, "Who's it from?" Toby told him. "You're to take it in yourself," said the porter, pointing to a room at the end of a long passage opening from the hall. "Everything goes straight in on this day of the year. You're not a bit too soon, for the carriage is at the door now, and they have only come to town for a couple hours a purpose." Toby wiped his feet, which were quite dry already, with great care, and took the way pointed out to him, observing as he went that it was an awfully grand house, but it hushed and covered up as if the family were in the country. Knocking at the room door, he was told to enter from within, and doing so found himself in a spacious library, where, at a table strewn with files and papers, were a stately woman in a bonnet and a not so very stately gentleman in black, who wrote from her dictation, while another and an older and a much statelier gentleman, whose hat and cane were on the table, walked up and down with one hand in his breast, and looked complacently from time to time at his own picture, a very full length, hanging over the fireplace. "What is this?" said the last-named gentleman. "Mr. Fish, will you have the goodness to attend?" Mr. Fish begged pardon, and taking the letter from Toby, handed it with great respect. "From Alderman Cute, Sir Joseph." "Is this all? Have you nothing else, Porter?" inquired Sir Joseph. Toby replied in the negative. "You have no bill or demand upon me. My name is Bowley, Sir Joseph Bowley." "Of any kind from anyone, have you?" said Sir Joseph. "If you have, present it. There is a cheque-book by the side of Mr. Fish. I allow nothing to be carried into the new year. Every description of account is settled in his house at the close of the old one, so that if death was to cut," suggested Mr. Fish. "To sever, sir," returned Sir Joseph with great asperity. "The court of existence, my affairs would be found, I hope, in a state of preparation." "My dear Sir Joseph," said the lady, who was greatly younger than the gentleman, "how shocking!" "My Lady Bowley," returned Sir Joseph, floundering now and then, as if in the great depth of his observations, "at this season of the year we should think of ourselves. We should look into our accounts. We should feel that every return of so eventful a period in human transactions involves matter of deep moment between a man and his banker." Sir Joseph delivered these words as if he felt the full mortality of what he was saying, and desired that even Trotty should have an opportunity of being improved by such discourse. Possibly he had this end before him, in still forbearing to break the seal of the letter, and in telling Trotty to wait where he was a minute. "I am the poor man's friend," observed Sir Joseph, glancing at the poor man present. "As such I may be taunted, as such I have been taunted, but I ask no other title." "Bless him for a noble gentleman," thought Trotty. "I don't agree with Cute here, for instance," said Sir Joseph, holding out the letter. "I don't agree with the Filer party. I don't agree with any party. My friend, the poor man, has no business with anything of that sort, and nothing of that sort has any business with him. My friend, the poor man in my district, is my business. No man or body of men has any right to interfere between my friend and me. That is the ground I take. I assume a paternal character toward my friend. I say, my good fellow, I will treat you paternally." With that great sentiment he opened the alderman's letter and read it. "Very polite and attentive, I am sure," exclaimed Sir Joseph. "My lady, the alderman is so obliging as to remind me that he has had the distinguished honour, he is very good, of meeting me at the house of our mutual friend Deedles, the banker, and he does me the favour to inquire whether it will be agreeable to me to have Will Fern put down. He came up to London, it seems, to look for employment, trying to better himself, that's a story, and being found at night asleep in a shed, was taken into custody and carried next morning before the alderman. The alderman observes, very properly, that he is determined to put this sort of thing down, and that if it is agreeable to me to have Will Fern put down, he will be happy to begin with him." "Let him be made an example of, by all means," returned the lady. "Last winter, when I introduced pinking and eyelet holing among the men and boys in the village as a nice evening employment, and had the lines, 'Oh, let us love our occupations, bless the squire and his relations, live upon our daily rations, and always know our proper stations,' set to music on the new system for them to sing the while, this very Fern, I see him now, touched that hat of his and said, 'I humbly ask your pardon, my lady, but ain't I something different from a great girl?' I expected it, of course. Who can expect anything but insolence and ingratitude from that class of people? That is not the purpose, however. Sir Joseph, make an example of him." Trotty, who had long ago relapsed and was very low-spirited, stepped forward with a rueful face to take the letter Sir Joseph held out to him. "You have heard, perhaps," said Sir Joseph oracularly, certain remarks into which I have been led respecting the solemn period of time at which we have arrived, and the duty imposed upon us of settling our affairs and being prepared. Now, my friend, can you lay your hand upon your heart and say that you also have made preparations for a new year?" "I'm afraid, sir," stammered Trotty, looking meekly at him, "that I am a little behindhand with the world." "Behindhand with the world," repeated Sir Joseph Bowley in a tone of terrible distinctness. "I'm afraid, sir," faltered Trotty, "that there's a matter of 10 or 12 shillings owing to Mrs. Chickenstalker." "To Mrs. Chickenstalker," repeated Sir Joseph, in the same tone as before. "A shop, sir," exclaimed Toby, "in the general line, and a little money on account of rent. A very little, sir. It oughtn't to be owing, I know, but we have been hard put to it indeed." Sir Joseph looked at his lady, and at Mr. Fish, and at Trotty, one after another, twice all around. He then made a despondent gesture with both hands at once, as if he gave the thing up altogether. How a man, even among this improvident and impractical race, an old man, a man grown gray, can look at a new year in the face with his affairs in this condition. How he can lie down in his bed at night and get up again in the morning, and there, he said, turning his back on Trotty, "Take the letter, take the letter." "I heartily wish it was otherwise, sir," said Trotty, anxious to excuse himself. "We have been tried very hard." Sir Joseph still repeating, "Take the letter," and Mr. Fish not only saying the same thing, but giving additional force to the request by motioning the bearer to the door. He had nothing for it but to make his bow and leave the house. And in the street poor Trotty pulled his worn old hat down on his head to hide the grief he felt at getting no hold on the new year anywhere. He didn't even lift his hat to look up at the bell tower when he came to the old church on his return. He halted there a moment, from habit, and knew that it was growing dark and that the steeple rose above him, indistinct and faint in the murky air. He knew, too, that the chimes would ring immediately, and that they sounded to his fancy at such a time like voices in the clouds, but he only made the more haste to deliver the alderman's letter and get out of the way before they began, for he dreaded to hear them tagging friends and fathers," to the burden they had rung out last. Trotty discharged himself of his commission, therefore, with all possible speed, and setting off trotting homeward. But what with his pace, which was at best an awkward one in the street, and what with his hat, which didn't improve it, he trotted against somebody in less than no time, and was sent staggering into the road. "I beg your pardon, I'm sure," said Trotty, pulling up his hat with great confusion, and between the hat and the torn lining, fixing his head into a kind of beehive. "I hope I haven't hurt you." As to hurting anybody, Trotty was not such an absolute Samson, but that he was much more likely to be hurt himself. And indeed, he had flown out into the road like a shuttlecock. He had such an opinion of his own strength, however, that he was in real concern for the other party, and said again, "I hope I haven't hurt you." The man against whom he had run, a sun-browned, sinewy, country-looking man with grizzled hair and a rough chin, stared at him for a moment, as if he suspected him to be in jest, but satisfied of his good faith, he answered, "No, friend, you have not hurt me." "Nor the child, I hope?" said Trotty. "Nor the child," returned the man. "I thank you kindly." As he said so, he glanced at a little girl he carried in his arms asleep, and shading her face with the long end of the poor handkerchief he wore about his throat, went slowly on. The tone in which he had said, "I thank you kindly," penetrated Trotty's heart. He was so jaded and footsore, and so soiled with travel, and looked about him so forlorn and strange, that it was a comfort to him to be able to thank anyone, no matter for how little. Trotty stood gazing after him as he plodded wearily along, with the child's arm clinging around his neck. At the figure in the worn shoes, now the very shade and ghost of shoes, rough leather leggings, common frock, and broad slouched hat, Trotty stood gazing, blind to the whole street, and at the child's arm clinging round its neck. Before he merged into the darkness, the traveller stopped, and looking round and seeing Trotty standing there yet, seemed undecided about whether to return or go on. After doing first one and then the other, he came back, and Trotty went halfway to meet him. "Can you tell me, perhaps," said the man with a faint smile, and if you can, I am sure will, and I'd rather ask you than another, where Alderman Cute lives?" "Close at hand," said Trotty. "I'll show you his house with pleasure." "I was to have gone to him elsewhere tomorrow," said the man accompanying Trotty, "but I am uneasy under suspicion, and want to clear myself and to be free to go and seek my bread. I don't know where. So, maybe he'll forgive my going to his house tonight." "It's impossible," cried Trotty with a start, "that your name's Fern." "Aye!" cried the other, turning on him with astonishment. "Fern, Will Fern," said Trotty. "That's my name," replied the other. "Why then," cried Trotty, seizing him by the arm and looking cautiously around, "for heaven's sake, don't go to him, don't go to him. He'll put you down as sure as ever you were born. Here, come up this alley, and I'll tell you what I mean. Don't go to him." His new acquaintance looked as if he thought him mad, but he bore him company nevertheless. When they were shrouded from observation, Trotty told him what he knew, and what character he had received, and all about it. The subject of his history listened to it with a calmness that surprised him. He did not contradict or interrupt at once. He nodded his head now and then, more in corroboration of an old and worn-out story, it appeared, than in refutation of it, and once or twice threw back his hat and passed his freckled hand over a brow, where every furrow he had ploughed seemed to have set its image in little. But he did no more. "It's true enough in the main," he said. "Master, I could sift grain from the husk here and there, but let it be said as 'tis. What odds? I have gone against his plans to my misfortune. I can't help it. I should do the like to-morrow. As to character, them gentlefolks will search and pry and have it as free from spot or speck in us, afore they'll help us to a dry good word. Well, I hope they don't lose good opinion as easy as we do, or their lives is strict indeed, and hardly worth the keeping. For myself, master, I never took with that hand, holding it out before him, what wasn't my own, and never held it back from work, however hard or poorly paid. Whoever can deny it, let him chop it off. And when work won't maintain me like a human creature, when my living is so bad that I am hungry out of doors and in, when I see a whole working life begin that way, go on that way, and end that way, without a chance or change, then I say to the gentlefolks, keep away from me, let my cottage be. My doors is dark enough without your darkening of, and more. Don't look for me to come up into the park to help the show when there's a birthday, or a fine speech making, or what not. Act your plays and games without me, and be welcome to 'em and enjoy 'em. We've now to do with one another. I'm best let alone." Seeing that the child in his arms had opened her eyes and was looking about in wonder, he checked himself to say a word or two of foolish prattle in her ear, and stand her on the ground beside him. Then, slowly winding one of her long tresses round and round his rough forefinger like a ring, while she hung about his dusty leg, he said to Trotty, "I'm not a cross-grained man by nature, I believe, and easily satisfied, I'm sure. I bear no ill will against none of 'em. I only want to live like one of God's almighty creatures. I can't, I don't, and so there's a pit dug between me and them that can and do. There's others like me. You might tell 'em off by the hundreds and by the thousands, sooner than by ones." Trotty knew that he spoke the truth in this, and shook his head to signify as much. "I've got a bad name this way," said Fern, "and I'm not likely, I'm afeard, to get a better. 'Tain't lawful to be out of sorts, and I am out of sorts, though God knows I'd sooner be a cheerful spirit if I could. Well, I don't know as this alderman could hurt me much without sending me to the jail, but without a friend to speak a word for me, he might do it. And you see," pointing downward with his finger at the child, he sunk his voice so low and gazed upon her with an air so stern and strange that Trotty, to divert the current of his thoughts, inquired if his wife were living. "I never had one," he returned, shaking his head. "She's my brother's child, an orphan. 9 years ago, though you'd hardly think it. But she was tired and worn out now. They'd have taken care on her in the Union, 28 mile away from where we lived, between 4 walls, as they took care of my old father when he couldn't work no more, though he didn't trouble them long. But I took her instead, and she's lived with me ever since. Her mother had a friend once, in London here. We are trying to find her, and find work too, but it's a large place. Never mind, more room for us to walk about in. Lily," meeting the child's eyes with a smile which melted Trotty more than tears, he shook him by the hand. "I don't so much as know your name," he said, "but have opened my heart free to you, for I'm thankful to you, with good reason. I'll take your advice and keep clear of this." "Justed," suggested Trotty. "Ah," he said, "if that's the name they give him, this Justice. And then tomorrow we'll try whether there's a better fortune to be met with somewheres near London. Good night, and a happy New Year." "Stay!" cried Trotty, catching up his hand as he relaxed his grip. "The New Year can never be happy to me if we part like this. The New Year can never be happy to me if I see the child and you go wandering away, you don't know where, without a shelter for your heads. Come home with me. I'm a poor man living in a poor place, but I can give you lodging for one night and never miss it. Come home with me. Here, I'll take her," cried Trotty, lifting up the child. "A pretty one I'd carry 20 times her weight, and never know I'd got it. Tell me if I go too quick for you. I'm very fast, I always was." Trotty said this, taking about 6 of his trotting paces to one stride of his fatigued companion, and with his thin legs quivering again beneath the load he bore. "Down the mews here, Uncle Will, and step at the back door with T. Vec, ticket porter," wrote upon the board. "And here we are, and here we go, and here we are indeed, my precious Meg, surprising you." With which words Trotty, in a breathless state, set the child down before his daughter in the middle of the floor. The little visitor looked once at Meg, and doubting nothing in that face, but trusting everything she saw there, ran into her arms. "Here we are, and here we go," cried Trotty, running around the room and choking audibly. "Here, Uncle Will, here's a fire, you know. Why don't you come to the fire? Oh, here we are, and here we go. Meg, my precious darling, where's the kettle? And here it is, and here it goes, and it'll boil in no time." Trotty really had picked up the kettle somewhere or other in the course of his wild career, and now put it on the fire, while Meg, seating the child in a warm corner, knelt down on the ground before her and pulled off her shoes and dried her wet feet with a cloth. Aye, and she laughed at Trotty too, so pleasantly and cheerfully that Trotty could have blessed her where she kneeled, for she had seen that when they entered she was sitting by the fire in tears. "Why, father," said Meg, "you're crazy tonight, I think. I don't know what the bells would say to that." Meg looked toward him and saw that he had elaborately stationed himself behind a chair of their male visitors, where, with many mysterious gestures, he was holding up the 6 pence he had earned. "I see, my dear," said Trotty, "as I was coming in, 1/2 ounce of tea lying somewhere on the stairs, and I'm pretty sure there was a bit of bacon too. As I don't remember where it was exactly, I'll go myself and try to find 'em." With this inscrutable artifice, Trotty withdrew to purchase the viands he had spoken of for ready money at Mrs. Chickenstalker's, and presently came back, pretending that he had not been able to find them at first in the dark. "But here they are at last," said Trotty, setting out the tea things, "all correct. I was pretty sure it was tea and a rasher. So it is. Meg, my pet, if you'll just make the tea while your unworthy father toasts the bacon, we shall be ready immediately." "It's a curious circumstance," said Trotty, proceeding in his cookery with the assistance of the toasting fork, "curious, but well known to my friends, that I never care myself for rashers nor for tea. I like to see other people enjoy 'em," said Trotty, speaking very loud to impress the fact upon his guest, "but to me, as food, they are disagreeable." Yet Trotty sniffed the savour of the hissing bacon, as if he liked it, and when he poured the boiling water in the teapot, looked lovingly down into the depths of that snug cauldron, and suffered the fragrant steam to curl about his nose, and wreathe his head and face in a thick cloud. However, for all this, he neither ate nor drank, except at the very beginning a mere morsel for form's sake, which he appeared to eat with infinite relish, but declared it was perfectly uninteresting to him. No, Totty's occupation was to see Will Fern and Lilian eat and drink, and so was Meg's. And never did spectators at a city dinner or court banquet find such high delight in seeing others feast, although it were a monarch or a pope, as those two did in looking on that night. Meg smiled at Trotty. Trotty laughed at Meg. Meg shook her head and made believe to clap her hands, applauding Trotty. Trotty conveyed in dumb show unintelligible narratives of how and when and where he had found their visitors. And they were happy, very happy. Although, thought Trotty sorrowfully, as he watched Meg's face, that match is broken off, I see. "Now I'll tell you what," said Trotty after tea. "The little one, she sleeps with Meg, I know." "With good Meg," cried the child, caressing her. "With Meg." "That's right," said Trotty. "And I shouldn't wonder if she kissed Meg's father, won't she? I'm Meg's father." Mightily delighted Trotty was when the child went timidly towards him, and having kissed him, fell back upon Meg again. "She's as sensible as Solomon," said Trotty. "Here we come, and here we—" "No, we don't. I don't mean that. What was I saying, Meg, my precious?" Meg looked towards her guest, who leaned upon her chair, and with his face turned from her, fondled the child's head, half hidden in her lap. "To be sure," said Toby, "to be sure. I don't know what I'm rambling on about tonight. My wits are wool gathering, I think. Will Fern, you come along with me. You're tired to death and broken down for want of rest. You come along with me." The man still played with the child's curls, still leaned upon Meg's chair, still turned away his face. He didn't speak, but in his rough, coarse fingers, clenching and expanding in the fair hair of the child, there was an eloquence that said enough. "Yes, yes," said Trotty, answering unconsciously what he saw expressed in his daughter's face. "Take her with you, Meg. Get her to bed. There. Now, Will, I'll show you where you lie. It's not much of a place, only a loft, but having a loft, I always say, is one of the great conveniences of living in a mews. And still this coach house and stable gets a better let. We live here cheap. There's plenty of sweet hay up there, belonging to a neighbor, and it's as clean as hands, and Meg can make it. Cheer up, don't give way. A new heart for a new year always." The hand released from the child's hair had fallen trembling into Trotty's hand. So Trotty, talking without intermission, led him out as tenderly and easily as if he had been a child himself. Returning before Meg, he listened for an instant at the door of her little chamber, an adjoining room. The child was murmuring a simple prayer before lying down to sleep, and when she had remembered Meg's name, "Dearly, dearly," so her words ran, Trotty heard her stop and ask for his. It was some short time before the foolish little old fellow could compose himself to mend the fire and draw his chair to the warm hearth, but when he had done so and trimmed the light, he took his newspaper from his pocket and began to read. Carelessly at first, and skimming up and down the columns, but with an earnest and a sad attention very soon. For this same dreaded paper redirected Trotty's thoughts into the channel they had taken all that day, and which the day's events had so marked out and shaped. His interest in the two wanderers had set him on another course of thinking, and a happier one for the time. But being alone again, and reading of the crimes and violences of the people, he relapsed into his former train. In this mood he came to an account, and it was not the first he had ever read, of a woman who had laid her desperate hands not only on her own life, but on that of her young child. A crime so terrible and so revolting to his soul, dilated with the love of Meg, that he let the journal drop and fell back into his chair appalled. "Unnatural and cruel," Toby cried, "unnatural and cruel. None but the people who were bad at heart, born bad, who had no business on the earth, do such deeds. It's too true, all I've heard today, too just, too full of proof. We're bad." The chimes took up the words so suddenly, burst out so loud and clear and sonorous, that the bell seemed to strike him in his chair. And what was that, they said? Toby Veck, waiting for you, Toby. Toby Veck, waiting for you, Toby. Come and see us, come and see us. Drag him to us, drag him to us. Haunt and hunt him, haunt and hunt him. Break his slumbers, break his slumbers. Toby Veck, door open wide. Toby Veck, door open wide, Toby. Then fiercely back to their impetuous strain again, and ringing in the very bricks and plaster on the walls. Toby listened. Fancy, his remorse for having run away from them that afternoon. No, nothing of the kind. Again, and yet a dozen times again. Haunt and hunt him, haunt and hunt him. Drag him to us, deafening the whole town. Meg, said Trotty softly, tapping at her door. Do you hear anything? I hear the bells, father. Surely they're very loud tonight. Is she asleep? Said Toby, making an excuse for peeping in. So peacefully and happily. I can't leave her yet, though, father. Look at how she holds my hand. Meg, whispered Trotty, listen to the bells. She listened with her face toward him all the time, but it underwent no change. She didn't understand them. Trotty withdrew, resumed his seat by the fire, and once more listened by himself. He remained there a little time. It was impossible to bear it. Their energy was dreadful. If the tower door is really open, said Toby, hastily laying aside his apron, but never thinking of his hat, what's to hinder me from going up into the steeple and satisfying myself? If it's shut, I don't want any other satisfaction. That's enough. He was pretty certain as he slipped out quietly into the street that he should find it shut and locked, for he knew the door well and had so rarely seen it open that he couldn't reckon above 3 times in all. It was a low arched portal outside the church in a dark nook behind a column, and had such great iron hinges and such a monstrous lock that there was more hinge and lock than door. But what was his astonishment when, coming bareheaded to the church and putting his hand into this dark nook, with a certain misgiving that it might be unexpectedly seized, and a shivering propensity to draw it back again, he found that the door, which opened outwards, actually stood ajar. He thought on first surprise of going back, or of getting a light, or a companion, but his courage aided him immediately, and he determined to ascend alone. "What have I to fear?" said Trotty. "It's a church. Besides, the ringers may be there and have forgotten to shut the door." So he went in, feeling his way as he went, like a blind man, for it was very dark, and very quiet, for the chimes were silent. The dust on the streets had blown into the recess, and lying there, heaped up, had made it so soft and velvet-like to the foot, that there was something startling even in that. The narrow stair was so close to the door, too, that he stumbled at the very first, and shutting the door upon him by striking it with his foot and causing it to rebound back heavily, he couldn't open it again. This was another reason, however, for going on. Trotty groped his way and went on. Up, up, and round, and up, higher, higher up. It was a disagreeable staircase for that groping work, so low and narrow that his groping hand was always touching something, and it often felt like a man or a ghostly figure standing up erect and making room for him to pass without discovery. That he would rub the smooth wall upward searching for its face, and downward searching for its feet, while a chill tingling crept all over him. Twice or thrice a door or niche broke the monotonous surface, and then it seemed a gap as wide as the whole church, and he felt on the brink of an abyss, and going to tumble headlong down until he found the wall again. Still up, up, round, and up, higher up. At length the dull and stifling atmosphere began to freshen, presently to feel quite windy. Presently it grew so strong that he could barely keep his legs. But he got to an arched window in the tower, breast high, and holding tight, looked down upon the housetops, on the smoking chimneys, on the blur and blotch of lights, towards the place where Meg was wondering where he was, calling to him perhaps, all knitted up together in a leaven of mist and darkness. This was the belfry, where the ringers came. He had caught hold of one of the frayed ropes which hung down from the apertures in the oaken roof. At first he started, thinking it was hair, then trembled at the very thought of waking the deep bell. The bells themselves were higher. Trotty, in his fascination or in working out the spell upon him, groped his way, by ladders now and toilsomely, for it was steep, and not too certain holding for the feet. Up, and climb and clamber, up, higher up, until ascending through the floor and pushing with his head just raised above its beams, he came among the bells. It was barely possible to make out their great shapes in the gloom, but there they were, shadowy and dark and dumb. A heavy sense of dread and loneliness fell instantly upon him as he climbed into this airy nest of stone and metal. His head went round and round. He listened, and then raised a wild "Halloa! Halloa!" was mournfully protracted by the echoes. Giddy, confused, and out of breath, and frightened, Toby looked about him vacantly and sunk down into a swoon.